All right, so next is no honorable exit. In the minds of leaders and members, there are no honorable or valid reasons to leave the organization.
Yeah.
Those who leave are denigrated or demonized.
Yeah.
And we're talking to one right now.
Yeah.
If you have detransitioned, do not speak on the trans experience. I'm going to say it again. Do not speak on the trans experience. You aren't trans if you detransition. You never were trans. You had an identity confusion that you needed to express somehow, and detransitioning isn't wrong. Okay, you found yourself good, but don't speak on the goddamn trans experience. When when HRT is life-saving, and these surgeries are life-saving even for minors, you have no right to go and bash on them and say it's wrong and they shouldn't be doing that. Because while it made you feel shitty about yourself, it saved my life and thousands of people's lives, just like me.
So I don't know if it's necessarily like 100% matchy, because there are those quote unquote good detransitioners, but you could argue that those ones that are good never actually left because they're still committed to the ideology.
No, I think that's the distinction here, is that if you're still committed to the ideology, you still participate with the activism and in the community, you haven't really left. Maybe you've made different choices in the level of your commitment, but you haven't left.
Right, yeah. So there are what they would say are valid reasons to detransition and to stop medicalizing. But I don't think that they would believe that there's any such thing as like an honorable reason to become gender critical, for example, or to stop believing in gender identity.
So I guess you brought up the term gender critical, and I think that's the first time it's shown up here, although it's been alluded to. I've tried to draw a distinction. We use the word ideology a lot, and I try to define that as a connected collection of beliefs about the way that the world works. And an ideology can be built on dogma, and we'll define dogma as statements or assertions that cannot be questioned. And so when we describe gender ideology, people may respond by saying, well, everyone has an ideology. Well, if it's a gender ideology and it's composed by a lot of dogma, a lot of things that cannot be questioned or proven true, then that may be different from a different ideology, which is not so dogmatic in that you're free to question or to challenge assumptions and thereby get closer to truth as measured by some sort of a rational way of measuring it. Is gender critical another ideology? What is gender critical?
And I think it depends on the person you ask. It might mean different things to other people, because I've read articles or blog posts where people are talking about being gender critical, and they're saying that it's not just disagreeing with gender ideology, it's also being critical of femininity and masculinity as a whole, and wanting to do away with that, wanting to abolish it. I'm saying gender critical just as like a shorthand for people critical of the concept of gender identity. So I'd prefer to say I'm critical of gender identity rather than gender critical, but it flows better. So
no, I get you. You know, we have this phenomenon where people will say I'm ex-Mormon, and that's not very descriptive. It just tells you where you've been from. But there are ex-Mormons who are Christians. There are ex-Mormons who are atheists. There's a bunch of different ways to be ex-Mormon. And so it's hard to pigeonhole all of them in it. But by using the word ex-Mormon, you're positioning yourself in distinct contrast to Mormonism. And so then people will say you've created a negative identity for yourself that is just another identity. And if you want to really move on, you need to abandon all of those labels and just move on and be yourself. And there may be some truth psychologically to that in the big picture, but for now, it helps at least people with shared experiences communicate with each other and find each other. Is there a term other than detransitioner that you feel like matches that? Because it sounds like detransitioner doesn't necessarily mean that you've left the ideology behind.
Yeah, we want it to mean that. When I say we, I just mean the other detransitioners that want that. So the people who have left the ideology want detransitioner to mean specifically that they've left the ideology. One of the reasons that we don't call ourselves ex-trans is because we didn't want it to be conflated with ex-gay.
Oh, okay.
So we didn't want people to be making parallels with the ex-gay movement as well.
Yeah.
It's different, but I feel like that's what it should mean. It should be synonymous with ex-transgender, and I guess that's where we are with the divide between detransitioners who say they're still trans. So
Yeah, and it seems like another complication with that is that there are trans individuals who don't root their transness in queer theory to the extent that the trans movement predominantly does today. Queer theory being that it includes all of this postmodern linguistic construction, decoupling sex from gender and seeing everything as arbitrarily socially constructed, and so it can be deconstructed and reformed any way you want. And that gives the extreme form of liberation that we've talked about already in this. Was there are trans people who say, no, I don't buy into any of that ideology about it, but I do, even though I understand that I'm a man, I just choose to live as a woman in society, but that doesn't require me to redefine those definitions for society as a whole.
Yes, people with those views, often they don't call themselves transgender and they call themselves transsexual instead. And I think maybe it's just a way of like reclaiming transsexual as a meaning. It means that they did something with their body, but that's all it means. It doesn't mean that they have a different gender identity or anything. So
That's a good distinction.
yeah, they tend to, and I like that better. I like that transsexual refers to like the material reality of someone's body instead of transgender just means they have an identity. I don't know. On the same topic, I'm just thinking about, I've classified everyone who's gone through medical transition as post transition, which is how I classify everyone who's been medicalized basically as part of the same political class. So that's one way in that.
And the contrast there would be desisters, who were people who had previously accepted the ideology, maybe identified as a different gender, but then later removed themselves from that way of thinking and that community without ever having taken surgical or medical steps.
Yeah.
So all of these different groups that we're talking about are people that would be considered those who had exited. And it seems like we mentioned this before, that if your position really is that gender identity is not fixed, it's fluid, and it can also be fluid over time, there should be no stigma to detransition. And that could and should be celebrated just as much as any other transition in somebody's life. But it's not. Why do you suppose that's the case?
I think that detransition implies something. It implies something about transition. And the reason that it's not celebrated by those same people is because even if they're not criticizing medical transition, there's still this aspect of the clinicians have failed. Something went wrong. This wasn't the proper path for them. And they might not even say that it wasn't the proper path for them. They might just say, oh, yeah, I needed it as part of my journey. But at the end of the day, it's still a clinical failure. It's still the treatment didn't do what it was supposed to do. And I think when the ideologues seeing that, they know underneath that it is a sign that something is going wrong. So it's not celebrated as much. It's pushed under the rug.
And that's where the blame reversal comes into play, so that the ideas itself, the dogma, can't be questioned.
Yeah.
Okay, so no honorable exit. What do you think?
Severe.
All right. There are a few things in this whole list that tend to be bigger red flags than other, and that no honorable exit is pretty powerful. Because you think of any other relationship or group in your life where if you decide you want to leave, people are like, oh, that's great. It's a non-issue. But when it becomes a big issue, it's a thing. That's where one of the things that we'll say in our own support groups is, if you want to assess whether or not a group is healthy or not, figure out how big the recovery group is from that church. So how big is the ex-Scientology recovery Reddit? And you can tell how traumatic something is, how difficult it is to leave, by how big the survivor community is.
That's interesting to think about. The Detrans Reddit is now 37,000 members. So,
and I've tried to follow that, but it seems like there's a troubled history with it, where because we're defining our societal norms of what constitutes hatred and bigotry according to the ideology itself, then all of that blame reversal, all of these things that we've been talking about get encoded into the rules of conduct for social media platforms themselves. So if people do want to come out and talk about this stuff, then they're labeled as hateful bigots by the social media platform and shut down. And that then is exploited by activists who want to get them shut down.
Yep. And we have that on, I'm one of the mods for the subreddit. So there is that sort of frequent, either people show up to try and say controversial things to try and get the subreddit banned. They'll post they'll just post things that are entirely inappropriate, just like porn or whatever, just to get the subreddit banned. People take things that we say out of context, and there are specific groups on Reddit, especially, that sort of monitor the groups that they think are hate groups, and they do think that Detrans is a hate group. And so they're just constantly talking about like how they're planning on taking us down and stuff like that. Yeah, no, I see how that's happened.
That plays a role into that whole no valid exit, because if you become a hateful bigot, if you leave, then, certainly that's not valid.
Mm-hmm.